Hello, everybody. I am delighted to bring you Joanna Cea and Jess Rimington. They are co-authors of Beloved Economies, Transforming How We Work. Their book has already been shortlisted for Porchlight Business Books of 2022. As soon as I saw the title of the book, Beloved Economies, I wanted to bring them here for you. Joanna is dedicated to reimagining investment and funding practices to uplift the well-being of all. Jess's work focuses on awakening the economic imagination of individuals to step out of business as usual to foster more just and resilient economies. Unfasten your seatbelts because we're about to take a ride into a future that is only beginning to exist. As you listen to them, think, what kind of economy and workplace do I really want to be in? They're here to tell you that a more just and caring society and organizations really are possible. Hello, everybody. I am beyond excited to bring to you Joanna Cea and Jess Rimington, who have written a marvelous book that invites us to reimagine work and reimagine capitalism. And I should add, part of reimagining work is reimagining who gets included in decision-making about the work. So, Joanna describes herself as dedicated to reimagining investment and funding practices to lift up the well-being of all. Jess describes herself, I love this, as a leading voice in the next economy movement. When she said next economy movement, I said, you mean there's really people talking about what should be the next economy? And they said yes. So we're going to get into it. They have the book that they have written is called Beloved Economies, Transforming How We Work, which has been shortlisted for the Porchlight 2022 Business Book of the Year Award. So in other words, the book is heavy duty, gaining recognition. And so we're more than honored to have the two of you here with us.
Thank you. We're so honored to be here. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah, you're going to call me Jean, and I'm going to call you Joanna and Jess.
Okay, you got it.
Let's tackle this big thing of what is a beloved economy, and then we can back up and find out who you are and how you got to even care about it, okay? But let's get our terminology together. What is a beloved economy? Economies is plural. And Jess, Jess.
Yeah, I mean, so we used the plural really intentionally on the book cover because part of what we're trying to do with this book and the research and what many of the folks who were involved in co-creating the research behind the book and then in crafting the narrative of the book are trying to do together is really expand our collective imagination to remember and to remind ourselves that there can be more than one model for economy. And there's so much about the way particularly the US culture and mindset around economy trains us to believe that there's this one type of economy possible, and it's called capitalism. And we've tried the other types, socialism, communism, and there was like 3 options. And, this is the best one. And there you have it, basically. And we're really trying what we can to expand the window of imagination that not only are our economies as plentiful and as diverse as in options as those who can dream them up, but also that we might have multiple types of economies even within, a nation state boundary, for instance. And we already have multiple economies coexisting within a larger economic context within even the US right now. So that's where the plural comes from. For us, from an activism perspective, we actually make a really explicit choice in this book to never define what a beloved economy is.
Okay, I was wondering about that. All right.
Yeah, because one of the things we feel that the current economic paradigm does, that we name the loveless economy in the book, which in its current manifestation in the US context and for much of the world is capitalism, is a particular form of neoliberal extractive capitalism. That economy, that loveless economy, does this really particular thing about kind of top-down imposing what an economy can and cannot look like. And we're trying to loosen up that imagination space and allow fertile ground to create fertile ground for more and more of us to dream into what our economies can be. That said, it's pretty confusing to do research around a topic when you don't have any definition for it. So I'll share what in practice.
Well, I want to ask Joanna a question before you continue, okay? Joanna, she said the word loveless 3 times, or 2 or 3 times. What is a loveless economy?
I'll speak to that, and I'm also going to come back to one thing about a beloved economy or economies.
Okay.
In the book, we chose to call it the loveless economy because of how many themes and reflections came up in our qualitative research over the years with enterprises, groups, organizations who were boldly departing from business as usual in some similar ways, which we can speak about, and who often ended up speaking about things that have to do with love or using the word love itself.
Explicitly.
Yes. And we also quote in the book bell hooks, who spoke very powerfully to a lovelessness that was becoming pervasive in our society, a turning away from an ethic of love. And that felt like such a powerful distillation of what was going on. As we were doing the research, the theme of love and working from an ethic of love came up in a very robust way, again and again, with multiple groups. And the reason we chose to call the current economy that most of us move around in and operate in the US, the loveless economy, was inspired by writing that Bell Hooks did on this topic decades ago, actually, in which she spoke about a rising ethic of lovelessness and a turning away from love and how our institutions and society and economic interactions function. And it doesn't have to be that way. And we wanted to name and call out the lovelessness of how we operate.
I think
I just had a conversation literally yesterday with someone who was accusing me, who was putting what was happening, what I was advocating for. The words were, this is business. This is not social work. And separated, and I was calling for greater inclusiveness of a group of people in the decision making around something, as opposed to centralizing it. This is business.
And business within a certain paradigm, right? But doesn't have to be the way business is. And I think one of the things that I think we both really want to make sure we do lift into attention and focus around the term beloved economy, that speaks to what you're speaking to as well, is that term is not our own. So that term was granted and bestowed upon the research by Dr. Wood, Dr. Reverend Virgil Wood, who's a longtime civil rights activist and educator. And we had actually been in year 6 of the research, the qualitative research, when we all met, when Dr. Wood and our research team met. And we were describing this different way of doing business, a way of doing business that was doing business, that prioritized sharing power in different ways, unlike perhaps what the person you were speaking to prioritizes in their business. And Dr. Wood said, well, that sounds like they're creating a beloved economy. And we're like, beloved economy?
Oh.
We've heard of community, but we haven't heard of beloved economy. And, kind of leaned in closer to dialogue with him to understand what he was seeing from the research of if businesses and organizations transform their way of work this direction, and if our economies are made up of businesses and organizations, then and workers, then what is the resulting economy, or the economy that we're co-creating together as we walk the path of work differently? And the more we were in dialogue together, the more sure we felt about that frame together, Beloved Economy being such a powerful, inspiration to, there's something intuitive about it. It feels like there's a disconnect, like how can an economy be beloved? But also there's something we felt, at least in the research collaboration, felt intuitive too, of like, but we long for that, whatever that is. There's a part of us that knows what that is. All of us together with Dr. Wood felt like we wanted to create a lot of spaciousness, and so everyone could define that for themselves, but an economy that feels like love, that turns towards the way that life moves and functions, that does share power, that thinks about the prioritization of inclusion.
Okay, so let's back up. Oh, Joanna, you wanted to say?
Just something I wanted to pick up on of your friend saying, this is business, this is not social work. Mm-hmm. The whole impetus for Jess and I starting the research and then carrying it through into the book and campaign and everything it's become was because we started discovering that enterprises that were operating in this less loveless way, if you will, far more inclusive in who they're bringing together as peers, co-owners, co-leaders, they were being more successful. Mm-hmm. And so the book is not about charity. It's not about what you should do or doing the right thing. It's about a whole group of 60 enterprises that were exceptionally successful in ways that are measured by our current economy, financial success, quality products, retention, etc., and whose teams and communities and stakeholders and clients were describing these whole other kinds of success around purpose and meaning and connection and even joy, and doing a sense-making process together to say what's happening so that with these enterprises, when they do cast the net wider and bring a far more diverse group of people around the table as peers, how is it that they're being successful? Because a lot of folks try that and maybe aren't always successful, right? It's not automatic. So
it can create chaos.
Exactly. So what is it that these groups are doing that's channeling a power of that into simply being more successful? Mm-hmm. So the reason this book is a business book, and we were so honored to be shortlisted for that award, is it's about business. It's about just being more successful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we got tantalized enough about how this thing might work that we want to understand it. But first, let's understand you. Can you each say something about your backgrounds and what got you from wherever you were to here? Jess?
Sure. Yeah, I think for myself, grew up in both a small business and also working class family, where I saw some of the negative impacts of the current economic system come to bear on my immediate family and just education access, what opportunities were available for work with kind of the limited education that my parents had been able to access. And then simultaneously saw the really brilliant ways that they were running their small businesses to survive, and kind of had a number of like gigs, that they were patching together, what we would call gigs now in the gig economy context. And how there was this real prioritization of relationship and community within that. And then I went on to my own education and saw a really different way of doing business being taught that maybe was professional, but didn't really model some of the values of resiliency and survival that I saw be really effective where I came from, and got involved in economic justice organizing for a number of reasons, and then saw that some of the organizations and impact first businesses maybe talked a good game, but their internal operations at the same time didn't model that externally espoused mission, which wasn't necessarily anyone's fault, because it's hard to pull from those tools. There's not a playbook. We only have, people are taught to just copy and paste from an MBA program, but those MBA programs are designed to create workers and leaders to continue extractive practices within an extractive economy, to work and do business in a particular way. So I just became obsessed with this idea of, what does it look like as someone who is pro-business, that saw small business do amazing things for my community and family, and even just transform people fully into the individual humans they wanted to become, and learn leadership skills through work together, through collaboration together. As someone who's pro that kind of business, what does business look like outside of capitalism?
Okay, that's a great question. Let's stop right there. Joanna, how did you get from there to here, to this book?
Great question. Well, I guess my answer changes sometimes, but I'll start not too far back. I grew up in a family with international roots and was very interested in how the US fits into what's happening around the world economically. And starting
international roots, let's a little more concrete.
My dad's family is originally from Poland and Lithuania, but 3 generations in South Africa. And then his parents and siblings and everyone immigrated to the US right before I was born, or as I was growing up. And my mom's family is originally from Ireland, but been in the US many generations. And I grew up with stories of apartheid South Africa and that side of the family's awakening of questioning it. I think I grew up with an interest of how systems and injustices happening in our country were linked to ones happening around the world. And the work I had the opportunity to do for the first 10 years coming out of college was doing policy advocacy to support, to push big financial institutions like the World Bank to operate in ways that were more accountable to the people they're supposed to benefit. So rather than pushing through a big, quote, development project that benefits industries in the US, what does it look like if that development project actually supports the aspirations of local folks on the ground? And I learned so much from peers and activists around the world in that work. And I became more and more frustrated and troubled by how it is that their plans and visions and very sophisticated ideas for development couldn't be heard by the systems and powers that be.
You said their plans, you mean the communities?
Community plans. So for example, in a farming region in Bangladesh, a whole plan for how to strengthen smallholder farms and water quality and access to education and whatever. But the official plan that gets rammed through is to turn that whole agricultural area into an open pit coal mine and export coal.
Whoa.
That happens all the time. And even more nuanced versions of that, one large scale gold mine gets pushed through for Mongolia, and maybe communities weren't totally anti-mining, but their recommendations for where things were sited were completely ignored, and the mine ends up getting sited on top of the most important spring that people use year round. Or just there are injustices that have happened in the US that continue to happen in the US, that happen globally. And many people are doing the work to stop those injustices. but I became, to use Jess's word of obsessed, I became obsessed with like, what is happening in the first place that all these people's designs and ideas for what development means to them aren't even getting on the table. Like, what is it about our current system? And it led me to be really curious about the design piece and how we change who is at the table for coming up with plans, and to look at that not just from a social justice lens, but to go back to my business point earlier. I saw like case after case of how ignoring those ideas ended up having a really negative bottom line impact eventually, like millions of dollars. And that if they had been able to hear as peers, like, why don't you think that person is equally brilliant? If you can't hear their idea, it limits the effectiveness and success of what you're building together. So to me, the research that led to this book started with an exploration of, hold on, could there be a business case for operating in a way that is far more inclusive and whole and seeing across great difference as peers with care and respect? Could there be a business case for that? And Jess and I went in with that as a legitimate question, like not a foregone conclusion, and looking at, what happens if we innovate out of loveless ways of work.
So let me just summarize what I'm hearing about your two backgrounds. And it's very similar, even though the platform is different or the scope is different. So Jess is observing, growing up in a family, seeing businesses run through relationships, through caring, through sharing, and then goes into, I want to say small town girl goes into big city.
That's real.
And sees all this anonymous, we're about the facts and the figures, and where the people just gets left out. And she says, wait a minute, I know it can work because I saw it with my own eyes. So that's Jess. And then Joanna goes and starts off with an international perspective of multiple ways of being and multiple norms, because your family comes from different places and you lived in a whole different place. So you grew up seeing these different cultures. And then you started saying, but wait a minute. And then you got into a situation where you saw community voices are omitted from decision making. You said, well, wait a minute. And so the two of you came together around the same wait a minute question. Isn't there another way where we can still have results? We could still have economic results. We could still have economic progress, but it includes people rather than excludes people.
Thank you for that. I feel
Is that accurate?
It is, yeah, in a way that feels therapeutic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, no wonder we collaborated, Jess.
I mean, your backgrounds ostensibly are different, but you're really the same. You see what can work and you see what's missing. And Joanna, you didn't see it working, but you saw the effects when community, love, caring, a broader set of voices were not included. Y'all may have heard this old, long ago thing about corporation decision makers. They were trying to name the car, a new car, and they came up with the term Nova. They were all white men. And the one Latina female secretary in the room said, wait a minute, Nova does not go. You'll never sell that car in Mexico. And if she had not been in the room and had the courage to speak up, they would have lost the millions of dollars that you, Joanna, were talking about. I mean, that's my example of what you were talking about.
It's a great example.
Okay. So, how to do it? How to do it? You have 7 practices. I'd like you to each, I'd like you to each take one or two of the practices or summarize what the practices are and explain it. Maybe, do you have a case that you can talk it through?
Sure. And I love that your question, Jean, goes to how to do it, because Jess and I described that when we met, I think you zoomed in on it in your summary, but we did really recognize something kindred in each other, and this focus and interest on the how, and how you're doing it. Our research actually didn't start out examining the how. We just had this bigger question of what happens when enterprises do innovate beyond harmful, draining, loveless ways of work. What happens? And we started looking to see, were there, we called it bright spots of groups who were operating in far more inclusive, power sharing, different kind of norm breaking ways and being really successful. And we were industry agnostic. I mean, we looked at everything from tech startups to disaster recovery programs to urban planning firms to cardiology department to youth groups. It was all over the map. But the commonality was groups had departed from business as usual ways of operating in significant ways in their field and were achieving forms of success that were really celebrated by those involved and peers. And as we were talking to those groups, we started to realize, wait a minute, everyone's, yes, doing very different things in their day-to-day, right? If you're a nurse in a cardiology department or coding in a tech company, but beyond the activity, there's a deeper pattern in how folks are working. And we ended up doing a participatory research process with groups in what we began to call our co-learning community, with these bright spot enterprises, to unpack and sense make together, what is it that they're all doing that is in common? And through rounds of iterating and distilling that, we got to these 7 practices. So I'll list them and then I'll just give one example. Should I do that?
Wait a minute. I want to just make sure people can follow what you just said.
Yeah.
So you were having the question of how are these groups being successful, including a lot of voices, including a lot of people. And you did your research, you used the word participatory. In other words, you involved people in participating in the research. And then the question was, what do these groups have in common that they're achieving these success by including a lot of folks?
Exactly.
And also, do they? First was, do they have?
Okay, that's great. Yes, do they? Because a lot of people think you need to narrow the scope of the parties involved in the decision for greater efficiency, and that including all those voices is the chaos that I had mentioned. Okay, so that's cool.
It wasn't just about number of voices too. It was about just the act of sharing power itself. So there wasn't like a quantity prioritization of like, this group's doing this better because they have 1,000 people included versus this group doing 10. Just to clarify, the sample size of folks included a wide range of those proving you could do this at scale, to folks just, a smaller company that changed the dynamic and moved beyond the worker manager paradigm.
So I'm going to list the practices and I'll do 1 or 2 cases here to illustrate them. But in no particular order, the practices are: share decision-making power, prioritize relationships, reckon with history, seek difference, source from multiple ways of knowing, trust there is time, and prototype early and often. So the 7 practices we found, in no particular order, are: share decision-making power, prioritize relationships, reckon with history, seek difference, source from multiple ways of knowing, trust there is time, and prototype early and often. So what do these practices mean in practice? I'll give one example from our co-learning community. So one of the groups, Concordia, They are New Orleans based. They're an architecture and community planning firm. And one of the oldest stories we've looked at in our process is from work they did immediately after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And the context there was right after the disaster, there were 2 attempts to come up with a recovery plan that was approved by the whole city, which needed approval to unlock urgently needed federal recovery funds. 2 quite expensive top-down efforts by top planning firms, each just ignited kind of a firestorm of criticism and couldn't get approval because so many groups and people in the community felt like this wasn't actually responsive to what was needed. Concordia offered to facilitate an alternative approach and kind of stepped up and organized it. And with less money and in less time, engaged over 9,000 residents, including folks in diaspora, in substantive design roles. And that project finally is what unlocked the funds. And we all know that what actually happened afterward is imperfect and everything. And it's a very complicated situation, but at least it got funds rolling, and it forged new relationships and ways of working, to which a lot of folks have continued to value. Seek difference. I know all of us here in this virtual room care a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that is a very strong factor of all the groups in our co-learning community. And they often take things a whole step further than what's often done in each of their fields, really being courageous in who they bring to the table, and not just convening lots of differences and lived experience and background and identity, but making sure the process is one that welcomes and makes everyone feel safe and able to share the brilliance they have. So one way.
Wait a minute. You said being courageous. Explain why that requires courage.
Sure. You know what? Go ahead, Jess.
Is being courageous to take the time needed to make sure everyone in the room is able to participate, being courageous in how budget allocation happens. So in order for Concordia to really make sure that there was ability to have as many diverse voices, as much types of diversity around the table as possible. This means thinking about things like, are we going to have childcare on site for the meeting? What time is the meeting? Are we paying stipends sometimes for participation? How do we think about how the agenda is structured? So, sometimes you'll be working, as we all know, in business as usual, and to allocate budget in certain ways, to take time to even talk about how do we have diversity, equity, and inclusion in a way that's not tokenism, in a way that there's actually channels for voice to lead to decision-making authority, not just presence in the room, can be put under the rug as like a fluffy nice to have. It takes courage to be like, no, this is essential. It's not just about tokenism. It's essential to make sure we're actually in shared power together.
Okay, so what you're saying is, if I am in charge and I just rely on me and my trusted little few people, then I think I'm deceiving myself into believing I have control of the outcomes. And so it takes courage to recognize I don't, and to expand beyond that and include other voices and provide the mechanisms for them to actually participate.
Mm-hmm. And to decide, for power to move differently in that room too. I think that, and also courage to push back on the norms, right? Of, yes. Often there'll be one person that actually may agree with us in this virtual room, but has to advocate within a system that isn't designed for everyone to be around the table.
Mm-hmm. And I think about, like, one of the groups in the co-learning community is a program called 10 Squared that serves factories around the world that have really entrenched problems with occupational health and safety. And they bring this 100-day innovation program to solve those problems. And they have this amazing record of solving problems that have gone unsolved for years, and they finally come up with a solution. And at the core of how 10 Squared works is they form a 10-person design team of 5 manager level folks and 5 factory floor level worker participants. And the stories they have of the courage that takes on all sides, like sometimes people getting yelled at, like they can't be in the room with her, or like for the
Really?
yes. And or even like some of the healthcare cases of research that puts researchers, doctors, and patients on level ground. It takes courage to call for it. It takes courage for everyone to show up and do that. Like, I think we don't realize in business as usual how much we're siloed and how much we devalue certain forms of expertise. And that's a huge part of what our book is about. And so we want to recognize, like, really seeking difference is a courageous act.
Okay. So Jess, another practice. This is my heart is literally starting to pound. This is exciting stuff because it's so contrary to what many people think is good business and good leadership.
Totally. And yet so in alignment with how the rest of life works. Isn't it amazing if a town center like a community group that we worked with quite a bit in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin, had this river running through town that had been really polluted over time, but that could be a huge potential source of recreation and commerce. And over time was becoming a hub of more local recreation activity, from kayaking to summer events that were happening around the riverside. And really thinking about within the decision-making structure of how that community foundation was prioritizing resources, what were they learning in their human interaction with that river of its priority and possibility for a rebirth of commerce of that town? What could that river provide that was different than what it was providing to the paper mill?
this practice is a great one in which to point out something we emphasize throughout the book, which is the practices are about balance. So a number of the co-learners point out in our chapter about source from all ways of knowing, this does not mean throwing out technical knowledge. It doesn't mean about one of the co-learners, Brooking Gatewood from a group called the Emergence Collective, mentions she's seen groups like swing so far from, oh, we were over prioritizing the written word, to stop documenting meetings, and then you have a lack of accountability, transparency, and documentation. Or, no one is saying we don't want the quantitative data from the experts. It's about enriching the field of information and bringing more things in. And the practice really tries to offer this the chapter in the book presents this practice in a way that gives any of us a starting point, because a lot of folks in current US may have never had the opportunity to listen to a river or learn from a river, as Jess is saying. But there's plenty of data in Harvard Business Review that when teams of people spend time in outdoor settings, new kinds of innovation and brain pathways are sparked. So you could do things as simple as, let's start our business retreat outside, or more and more groups, even in business as usual, are bringing in meditation, or bringing in. So it's just about what are ways we can operate that help expand the kinds of knowledge and insight coming in that can move us toward the most successful outcomes.
Right. So let's go beyond traditional sources of knowledge, traditional expertise. And nature is a ripe field for that. And there are people that we would not normally turn to, but who are affected by this. They are another rich source.
Yep. And bodies info from movement and somatic work that the chapter mentions a bunch of things, but it calls to attention. We might not realize in the loveless economy how many channels of information are actively shut down. So this is just about reopening those, bringing those in as also legitimate sources of ideas and inspiration in business.
Okay, so I want to ask this question. I'm looking at the time. We know we've only covered 2 practices. There are 5 more to go, and readers can get your book and learn the others. Okay, my question is, what is there besides capitalism that you say works? You say there are a lot of other economies. Point to even one of them.
Well, we're going to answer your question with posing more questions for the audience. What we're really trying to advocate here is economic imagination, and to try to get us to ask that question less, actually, to try to get us to, because that is how capitalism continues to win. If capitalism is personified here, let's just make it personified for the sake of this dialogue. Capitalism's like, you show me what works better than me, and I'm going to make it so hard to have practice and imagination of an alternative that it's going to feel like stepping out of capitalism is equivalent to death. It's going to feel like you're going to lose your livelihood. There's going to be like food lines. It's going to be a scarcity. Nothing will work. It will be this authoritarian, all these images and propaganda we've been shown. And the only alternatives are these other isms that have been floated around and used in a sort of pseudo-political context. And what we're more interested in is if we make the path by walking it, then what happens if we just start to walk out of what isn't working? What happens if we just start to choose work practices that are not extractive and stop becoming so obsessed with or feeling as though we have to prove to who is this person we keep trying to prove to? Who's this body that needs the evidence that this other ism or set of isms has to exist, and we have to full scale the solution first, to just start walking out. So if we change our work practices, if we change how we move as workers, if we change how we move as consumers, if we change how we move as business leaders and managers and organizations and businesses, we will start to find ourselves, like many of the groups and companies that we're in touch with, starting to operate with one foot out of this system. And where they end up when they have both feet out, we don't know. We're not proposing to know.
So it doesn't, what you're talking about, the alternative does not yet have a name. That's how I'm translating what you're saying.
I think we don't yet know what these systems fully look like.
Okay. So they haven't been defined, therefore they don't have a name. And the challenge you're offering all of us is to walk it and see what evolves.
And probably focus less on the naming and taxonomy, since that's
Human
tools
beings
of organization too.
Human beings are meaning-making machines.
Totally. Can we start to feel it before we name it?
Yeah, that's one way of being. And that'll work for those who have that capacity. I literally know someone who does not have empathy, that cannot feel it. They have to think it. So not everybody, feeling is one way of knowing. So we have to have something that for people who have different ways of knowing, for them to understand it. And so I'm talking to the thinking, not the feeling people. Say that what you're saying is right now, do the practice, observe, and see what evolves.
And see what new thoughts you have too. And the only reason I mentioned feeling is just the current system over prioritizes rational thinking.
Absolutely.
A pendulum swing. But that exists in equity with the need to think out of the system too, right? And see where we end up.
Okay. Joanna, you want to add to that?
I know we just have 1 minute here. I think one of the hallmarks across the work of where groups end up when we call it deconsolidate rights to design, they end up sharing power to design and own and lead, right? We know our current system has a real wealth inequity problem. We expose in the book that also along with wealth, we accumulate power to decide and design.
Okay.
A beloved economy distributes that power to design our future and our business and our life. And that often means wealth is, like, as Jess said, still pro-business, still, generating wealth, but looking at different ways that can be shared and not assuming there's only one thing that's been tried for what shared wealth looks like. But what does it look like to prioritize different kinds of ownership, different kinds of leadership, prioritizing care and not just maximization of financial growth at all costs, and that it can be legitimate to make those choices, and that in fact sometimes even more successful.
Okay, so I want to thank both of you, Jess and Joanna, for being here, for inviting us to think outside of our traditional little boxes of hierarchy and authority. And I want to encourage everybody to get your book. Please tell people how to reach you and how to find your book.
Sure, you can buy our book wherever you like to buy books, Beloved Economies, Transforming How We Work. And you can learn more about the research and whole initiative behind it at belovedeconomies.org.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jean.
Thank you so much, Jean.
My main takeaway is that it really is possible for organizations and communities to set up structures where decision-making is shared and the well-being of people is considered along with profits and efficiencies. We don't have to choose. Their book gives actual case studies where innovative leaders had the courage to suspend their need for tight control and instead to involve whole communities or groups of people in decision-making. And the result has been better than anyone anticipated. And listening to them, I couldn't help but think of some of the diversity, inclusion, and equity initiatives that I've known about. In the conversation today, none of us even use the vocabulary of DEI because those concepts are automatically embedded in the work. If you're figuring out a way to involve a whole community in decision-making, as leaders did in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, then by definition, you're talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity. As Joanna and Jess said, it takes courage to try. And that's what I wish for you and for all of us. The courage to envision a world that works for all of us, and the courage to try out different ways of working so it might actually happen. You can learn more about me and my work at leadingconsciously.com. And you can get involved with the program I personally developed, Pathfinders, Leadership for Inclusion and Equity. Membership is limited, but there is a new session starting every 2 months. Use the link in the description below for details. Thank you for listening. And until next time, let's create the world we want to live in.